have ever waited days for lab results, you already understand why point of care diagnostics matter. These compact, decentralized devices are reshaping how and where testing happens. Now, we're trying, of course, to compress these turnaround times from days to minutes. But of course, delivering that speed and more importantly, that accuracy in a small and reliable package is an engineering challenge. I think we can all agree on that. Inside every POC device, precise coordinated motion drives every single thing from sample loading and reagent delivery to valve actuation and analytical processing. Getting that motion right means selecting the right technologies and optimizing them for performance and usability. And that's exactly what we're going to be digging into today. Dave Beckstoffer, Senior Industry Manager on the medical team at Portescap, which is a Regal Rexnord brand. Dave brings more than 34 years of motion control experience to this work. And of course, he does this with a sharp focus on marrying motor, gearing, feedback technologies, all of this in a laboratory and diagnostic equipment that surpasses everything. Together, we're going to examine the trends reshaping POC device development, explore the motor and motion technologies powering these systems, and walk through how engineers can evaluate and select the right solutions. Dave, it's great to have you.
And it's great to be here, Dean. Thank you very much for allowing me to share the Regal Rexnord experience with the engineering community.
Thank you. So let's get started. What are point of care diagnostic devices and what do they offer patients and clinicians?
So, Dean, as you mentioned, there's been a big push in the medical industry to decentralize the diagnostics. So, historically, you've seen laboratories that have been completing the diagnostics. They would have to take the sample from the doctor's office, bring it to the lab, do the analysis, and then bring it back to the doctor's office, which again, can take hours up to days. So the desire has been to bring the analysis capability to the point of care, meaning at the patient. So that's been enabled by these point of care devices, which are effectively taking the laboratory instruments and shrinking them down so that they can fit into a doctor's office, into a clinic, or into a hospital environment. So these point of care devices are typically either handheld, where they're addressing one particular type of infection or doing one particular type of analysis, to benchtop devices, where they're possibly doing one type of analysis, but also looking at multiple biomarkers to do a higher level of analysis. So the patient benefits because the analysis is brought closer to them, which means that the medical professional has the ability to provide them care in a much quicker fashion. And the medical professional benefits because they're able to perform the analysis, translate the symptoms into the potential solution, and confirm that as easily as possible with the diagnostic device being right there. So they're also able to extend this to patients' homes. These diagnostic devices are able to be used in home care for patients with chronic illnesses. They're able to maintain the analysis of how their illness is proceeding, and the medical professional can then either continue the treatment or alter the treatment as needed.
Yeah. And that's really, I can tell you, I've had family members that have had to use devices like this
Yes.
because it's critical to get real-time data, but also just as important is that you're gathering it all the time
Right.
and being able to get that feedback. So
Absolutely. Absolutely.
that's incredible. Now, what trends are shaping the development of today's POC devices?
Dean, so the main trend is miniaturization. Because as you can imagine, going from a lab instrument to a doctor's office, there's a significant limitation in space. As you and I both go to the doctor routinely, there's not much space in a doctor's office. They've got a lot of offices, but when you go in where they draw blood, They typically have one, maybe two counter spaces for these types of devices. So miniaturization is the primary trend that's seen, and that lends itself to the portability of the machine as well. We've also seen, a trend in terms of that expansion of testing capability. So instead of having, one device that may be for specific tests, if you can bring all of that together into a larger device, still fitting within the doctor's office or the clinic, then you're able to do a lot more analysis in a shorter period of time. So that's again is another benefit for the patient that this trend is bringing. Another thing that's in play is the ease of use of these devices, because you're going from a laboratory environment where you've got laboratory professionals that are, quite used to these types of instruments, and now you're bringing them into a location where you've got medical professionals that have many different responsibilities. So for this level of diagnostic testing, these point of care devices need to be very straightforward and simple and be able to, just have the sample load in, maybe a button push to set the protocol, and then they go away and do their analysis. And then as you just mentioned, the connectivity, that enablement of data to be fed back to the medical community, that continual development in the loop, and potentially using AI as part of advancement and enhancement of the treatment of the patients.
Yeah, and that's really the goal at the end of the day is uh, the user experience, the
Yes.
patient at the end of the day. That's
Yes,
really
absolutely.
critical. Now, now, how are those trends influencing the way engineers design these POC systems?
Well, Dean, as you teed it up at the beginning, engineers have a very tough task. They've got this wide variety of different movements that are occurring inside of these devices, and they have to do that in the smallest design architecture that they can. So, very big challenge. There's a lot of different things they're trying to do, and these design engineers basically have the understanding of the analysis and diagnosis portion, but may not have the exact engineering capability for the movement and the motion that goes on. So, engineers may come into it and go, "Wow, this is a lot to take in," and that's where a company like Regal Rexnord that has application engineering teams, it's a benefit to the community because we're able to bring the motion experience in together with the objectives of the device, and that basically helps out the engineer in optimizing the systems. And then with that additional testing capability, we talked about the coordination within the machine. You may have a sample that's going to go through different tests, so it's got to move around, but you don't want it to take too much time. So and a lot of different things coming in that need to be added to the sample to enable the analysis. So all of that coordination tied together with the fact that efficiency is always a primary thing in any device that's being developed, both system efficiency and energy efficiency. Sustainability is a very big push in the medical field. So all of these devices have to be very energy efficient at the end of the day.
Yeah. And now, what motor and motion technologies are common in POC devices? And of course, what drives engineers to select one over another?
Yeah, as you can imagine, Dean, with the different level of axes that are in these machines, it kind of can come into all three primary motion technologies, which are stepper motors, DC motors, and brushless motors. So when you're looking at the decision, you can first look at can stack step motors, which are step motors basically are very simple in their design. They take a pulse train input and then turn that into a number of steps. So there's an inherent mechanical precision that you get from a step motor. So these, when you're talking about the different types of analysis, you need precise movements. As you mentioned, precision, accuracy, and repeatability are the three pillars of these point of care diagnostic machines. So to enable that precision, step motors are a very good choice. They're also quite cost effective. They're made out of stamped metal parts for the casings, and they're made in higher volume. So those can be very good options for engineers to consider, and some of the axes. And then you look at an extension of the CAN stack is their linear actuators, where basically the design of the motor itself is translating the rotational movement into linear movement. These can be both non-captive and captive. Non-captive, where the lead screw is actually traveling through the motor itself, and then captive, which is translating it into a true linear motion. So where you're getting a force output of a linear actuator as opposed to a torque output of a rotational motor. So the captive ones in particular are great for very compact, tight space requirements. You typically linear travel less than an inch are ideal for the linear actuators. And then you move into some of the primary DC and brushless applications. DC and brushless motors are inherently higher in efficiency than the stepper motors, and they're also capable of higher speeds. DC motors, very simple, apply a voltage, and you get a rotational speed. Brushless motors, a little bit more complex in that you need a driver to commutate the brushless motor effectively. But these motors giving a higher speed, coupling with gear heads, or give the ability to provide a different motion profile, which can be very useful on XY axes, for example. And then all of these are tied together with linear components. Typically for linear options, you have lead screws and ball screws. But because of the size of these diagnostic devices, it really leads itself to lead screws, which is the best solution for the linear components. And as we've talked, the engineers have all of this balance. You've got torque, speed, force, speed, efficiency, all of these different things that they're struggling with. And Regal Rexnord having both the Thompson and Portescap brands, bringing the motion technology and the linear components together, it really helps the engineers, from the onset of the program, to be able to understand those different choices and which one's going to make the most sense for the different axes within the device.
Now, now you guys are where design and engineering come together,
Yeah, absolutely.
because
Absolutely. With
I think
60
they're
years
two
of
different
experience
skills.
in this, yes, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, Dave, you mentioned the X and Y axes. Now, what are the typical axes of motion found within the POC diagnostic platforms?
Yeah, and the easiest way to think about it is, to just basically follow the sample. So when you get a sample, let's say it's a blood drawn from, a patient, then that sample has to be introduced to the machine. So that can be introduced, either dropping the blood into the machine or entering the test tube into the machine. So that's the sample loading portion of the motion axes for the point of care device. And then once that sample gets into the machine, then you come into the XY movement. So that sample has to be positioned around within the device to do the different functions that are required for the analysis. And then one of the key applications is the dispensing of the reagents. So the reagents are introduced as the detectors. Basically, they're going to determine whether there's an absence or presence of a particular biomarker in the sample. So those can be introduced either via blister burst, where you've got a little packet of a reagent and that's burst, for lack of a better term, to introduce that reagent to the sample. Or it can be introduced via pump, and the motion's going to drive the pump, but also the valve actuation to allow that precise amount of reagent to be added. And then there's some, when you get into the higher level testing capabilities of these devices, you have magnet rotation, where if they're magnetic nanoparticles that you're detecting, that can help isolate those. There's beam focus if you need, a more accurate view. Sometimes there's beams that can be focused more directly onto the portion of the sample that's being analyzed. And then ultimately the sample comes out of the machine. So that's another area where the motion can benefit and have a axis in the point of care device.
Now, what motion and technology solutions support, like you mentioned, blister burst samples, sample loading, and the X and Y actuation of POC? So, what motion and technology solutions support these?
Yeah, as we've talked about, Dean, there's always a couple different options that can be, in play for those different. So if we take the sample loading, you may have the two different options of either, dropping the sample into the device or inserting a test tube. So if you're dropping the sample in, then you typically have a syringe drive, or you have a pump that's pulling that sample into the device onto the XY axes. And those can be accomplished with linear movement for the syringe, either with a can stack linear actuator or a linear drive utilizing a DC motor and a lead screw. As I mentioned, the pumping will be enabled by a motor, typically a DC motor on the pump, and then a valve actuation, which is typically a can stack motor, because that's simply a precise positioning application, which is very well suited for can stacks. And then in the case of the test tube, you're talking about like a door actuation. So basically, the door will open up, the test tube would be put in, and then it draws it back into the machine. And that's done with a can stack motor with a gear drive. So that's a very cost-effective, it's I would say it's a simple motion axes, but relative to the others, it's very straightforward. So can stacks are very well suited for those. And then once it gets in, as we talked about the XY motion, that's effectively moving that sample within the machine. So the typical motion are accomplished either with can stack motors or DC motors. And that can depend on whether it's a device that's set up for a single test or a multiple test. So if you've got a single test, it may be more straightforward. The compactness of the device may lend itself more to the pancake style motor of a can stack. Whereas if you've got a larger device that's doing multiple tests, you may need a little bit of extra speed. You may need a little bit size reduction or a cylindrical type motor, and that's where the DC motors, potentially with the gearbox or a linear drive, come into play for the XY. And then the blister burst is a really fun one because it's if you think about a little tiny bubble of reagent, you've got a couple different primary ways of bursting it. You can use a can stack linear actuator. Again, that captive version is the most suited because it's going to give you that direct linear force. And that's basically just going to depress the bubble until it releases the reagent to the sample. But depending upon the throughput of the machine, and again thinking about those multiple test machines, a DC linear drive can be also effective. That's going to be able to do it in a little bit faster fashion. And when you talk about speed, it always comes down to the question of is too much speed a disadvantage in a particular axis, because you don't want to go too fast, because again you've got to go back to that precision, accuracy, and reliability that always has to be maintained. So the thing we do with Regal Rexnord is we present those different options for those axes, give the different advantages and disadvantages, and then discuss with the engineer, and have that outcome be the most suited for that particular device.
Excellent. Yeah, I always think of it in terms of gearing too. A lot of times, are you looking for speed or torque? What
Right.
you're gonna have to make some sacrifices of one thing versus another whenever you're doing things. So if I'm trying to chase one thing down, then I'm gonna make a sacrifice on the other side. But that helps to optimize the product for what your needs are, right?
Right. And that's where you need a trusted partner, Dean, because you need somebody that knows how to do the motion side of things, so that the engineers that are designing the device can focus on what they know and what they need to accomplish with the device. So it really is a true partnership to help optimize a point of care device.
That's great. Now, what does the typical design process for a POC device look like? How should engineers evaluate motion solutions at each stage?
So it follows the path of most medical device design. So you have an ideation phase where you may be a new company that's got a revolutionary way of doing analysis, and you've got this idea, and that you need to understand if that will truly transform the industry. Or you may be an established company where you've got a device out there, and based on your market feedback, you're saying, okay, we need the next generation to come through. So you've got this idea phase, and you're basically using things that you have available. If you're have a current product, you're just using some of the existing motion solutions that you have, or if you're a new company, you're kind of using what you have sitting around in your own lab to be able to just make sure this concept, or excuse me, this idea moves forward. And then that kind of leads into the concept phase, where you're kind of beginning to bring the point of care device together, test out its functionality, and make sure it's working to give the results that you would like. And that's where you typically will use off the shelf solutions. You'll have standard can stack motors, DC motors, linear components, and you'll bring those in, and then just again get that functionality moving forward. And then that goes into the feasibility stage, where you're really honing in the design, you're finalizing the design, and the motion solutions there typically have come under some iterations. So you're looking at more customized solutions, more solutions that are honed in for the exact axes of movement within the device. And that, once you get into the end of feasibility, you are freezing the design of your device, and then it enables you to go into the validation phase. You're building with production intent or production motion solutions. You're creating all of the test data that you need for regulatory approval. Doing all the other 510K submissions, everything else that's required for medical devices. And then you're moving into the production qualification once you get that regulatory approval. And those are production line motion solutions that are provided. And one thing to mention, Dean, the earlier that, kind of that motion is considered in the whole scheme of things, that helps reduce those iterations, because, that partnership carrying through provides a big benefit throughout the entire process.
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head there of the partnership aspect when it comes to when you bring in people. In my experience over the years, that's one of the things I always emphasize, is that when it comes to engineering, having all the parties at the table earlier is better than later. You bring them in later, now you're limiting them to what their solution can be.
Right, right. And Dean, I've been doing this for 34 years, and quite honestly, the thing I love most is just talking with the design engineers, talking with the customers, just utilizing what I've learned to benefit the customers, because ultimately that's benefiting us, the people, patients, everybody, so that's a very enjoyable part of what I get to do each day.
And I could see that in you. You're
Yeah.
that you're passionate about. That's
Yes.
great. Uh, in what ways can Regal Rexnord accelerate the design and development of POC diagnostic devices?
So that's a good lead in, Dean. I mean, in that ideation phase, again, you want to have those discussions. You may have a revolutionary new way of doing things, but physics is always there. And if you can't accomplish it with a motion solution, then, the best idea remains just an idea. So bringing, Regal Rexnord to the table in the ideation phase, we can say, yes, that's possible. Maybe it's possible, or no, that's just, well outside of the realm that physics will enable to be done.
Sure.
So that, helps take that ideation phase and compress it, which is key to get into the concept. And, in the concept phase, we bring forward the ability for off-the-shelf solutions, short lead times for prototypes, but then also that engagement of discussion around what does the motion solution need to look like. So you're not only going to say, okay, just buy this can stack motor that'll open and close the door. We'll talk about, hey, you've got some gearing in there. What's the most efficient way of doing the gearing? Is it more of a module? Is it, just a simple motor and a pinion? So we have those discussions in the concept phase, because when you lead into feasibility, all of that work in parallel brings those custom solutions, even subsystems. We talked about linear drives. All of those potentials basically come together before the design freeze. So now you have that optimized system that can produce the output that the design engineers wanted to from that ideation phase.
Gotcha. And I would imagine that reliability has to be critical too, because
Yes.
not every component has the same reliability within that.
Absolutely. And, we have those discussions in the ideation phase of what is needed. How long does the device need to last? How long does this axis move each time an operation or an analysis is done? So, yeah, all of those discussions lead to very fruitful design discussions, which ultimately, again, lead to that best device.
Great. Yeah. Now, how does Regal Rexnord view the evolution of patient care and the role of motion technologies will play in that?
Well, Dean, as we've talked about the evolution going from labs to point of care, we see that that's going to continue to evolve. So, the ultimate goal is when a patient's sick, we want to enable the medical professionals to make those decisions quickly and make them more effective. We see the evolution being to more patient focused care because, Dean, you and I could get the exact same disease, but your genetics are different than mine. Your history is different than mine. So enabling the medical professional that's treating either one of us to have the ability to do the analysis and diagnosis right there in the doctor's office, in the hospital, in the clinic when you need it, really very much shortens that time for getting to the precise treatment that each patient needs. So we see that continued evolution coming. And then we also see the research and development phase. We're seeing newer cures for diseases, newer treatments for diseases. All of these things are enabled by current motion technologies and advancements in motion technologies that will be coming. So there's always a position for motion, and there's always a requirement for motion in all of these advancements and all this evolution that's taking place. And at Real Rexnord, our role is not simply to power motion, but we're enabling that advancement throughout the medical community. And we're, kind of helping transform the patient care from that onset of diagnosis to that ultimate treatment that's being received.
That that's really phenomenal. Thanks so much, Dave. I really appreciate your insights today. And I know that everyone out there watching at work or at home does too.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here, and we always welcome the opportunity to share our knowledge with the global spec community.
Now, stay tuned for this from Regal Rexnord.